13th saw Napoleon in the billiard room. He was in very good spirits. Spoke about the possibility of his having remained in France after the Battle of Waterloo in spite of the efforts of the Allied powers. My own opinion was, said he, that I could not have done so without having shed the blood of hundreds by the guillotine. I must have plunged my hands up to this in blood, stretching out one arm and applying the finger of the other to his armpits. Had the legislative body displayed courage, I might have succeeded, but they were frightened and divided amongst each other. Lafayette was one of the chief causes of the success of the enemies of France. To have given me a chance, I must have had recourse to the most sanguinary measures. The conduct of the Allies in declaring that they waged war against me alone had great effect. Had it been possible to have rendered me inseparable from the nation, no efforts of the Allied powers would have succeeded, but as it was, by isolating me and declaring that if I were once removed, all obstacles to a peace would cease, people became divided in their sentiments, and I determined to abdicate and remove, as far as I was concerned, every difficulty. Had the French nation guessed at the intentions of the Allies, or that they would have acted as they have done since, they would have rallied around me, but they were overreached like the lambs of the fable when the wolves declared they only waged war against the dogs. But the dogs once removed, they fell upon and devoured the lambs. There is a great difference of opinion, continued Napoleon, as to what I ought to have done. Many were of opinion that I ought to have fought to the last. Others said that fortune had abandoned me, that Waterloo had closed my career of arms forever. My own opinion is that I ought to have died at Waterloo, perhaps a little earlier. Had I died at Moscow, I should probably have had the reputation of the greatest conqueror ever known. But the smiles of fortune were at an end. I experienced little but reverses afterwards. Hitherto I had but unconquered. I ought to have died at Waterloo, j'aurais dû mourir à Waterloo. But the misfortune is that when a man seeks the most for death, he cannot find it. Men were killed around me, before, behind, everywhere, but no bullet for me. A letter written to Sir Hudson Lowe by Count Bertrand, stating that he had not yet seen the captain of the vessel who had brought the bust, and expressing a wish that he might be permitted to come to Longwood. Napoleon walked in the evening for some time with Count Montauban. 18th. A reply was returned by the governor to Count Bertrand's note, stating that the bust had not been brought out by the captain of the Bearing. A request was, however, again made by the count that he should be permitted to visit Longwood. And on this day, Captain Lamb, a half-pay lieutenant of the Navy, came to see Count Bertrand. On his return, I asked him to favor me with some information about the bust. He stated that it had been passed and sent on board from the custom house in charge of the gunner of his ship, an Italian who formerly had been for many years in the British Navy. At the day after his arrival at St. Helena, he had mentioned the circumstance at a gentleman's house and had demanded to be informed of the best mode of transporting it to Bonaparte, when he was directed to apply to Sir Thomas Reed, who had made numerous inquiries on the subject, amongst others whether he had mentioned the circumstance to any person in the island, to which he answered that he had related it. He had spoken of it at a dinner party. He was then asked how he could think of bringing out such an article, being contrary to the instructions, and was finally desired by Sir Thomas Reed to say nothing about the matter, and also to request to those to whom he had mentioned it to be equally silent. I observed that he must be aware of the report which was current in the island relative to the recommendation said to have been made to him to throw it overboard or break it into pieces, a contradiction of which I was anxious to hear from his own mouth. Captain Lamb replied that he had heard the report, which was very general, but not true, and professed that he did not know what it could have arisen from. On this gentleman's return to town, he alighted at Sir Thomas Reed's, and after a stay of a few minutes proceeded to Plantation House on one of the governor's horses. 19th, the Podargus brought the intelligence that the Conqueror, with the new Admiral Plampin, had arrived at the Cape. Letters received for Count Bertrand, Count Gorgot, and Marchand. The Admiral and Lady Malcolm, with Major Boys of the Marines and Captain Jones, Royal Navy, paid a visit to Napoleon. Count Fagan, formerly judge and advocate in India, had also an interview with him afterwards. The colonel, who spoke French like a native, said that Napoleon asked him many questions in his profession, which puzzled him, and that he was extremely shrewd in his remarks. So Napoleon, in the evening, he informed me that he had seen Sir Pulteney and Lady Malcolm. Also, Colonel Fagan, the Admiral, said he endeavored to support the governor and said that I might depend upon it. He had sent my observations on the restrictions to England. Indeed, he advocated his conduct so much that I told him he was like the rest of the English, trop egoist. That not being myself an Englishman, their laws did not protect me, and I had no justice to expect from them. E troppo inglesi. I told him that in Lord Blank's speech there were 3 calumnies and 10 lies, and that I intended to answer it. He tried to excuse him in the same manner the governor did by stating that the report of the speech in the newspapers might not be correct or faithful, and was not to be depended upon. He's mistaken, however. In France, even during the time of the revolutionary fury, the speeches were faithfully reported. I gave milady one of my fine porcelain cups with a figure of Cleopatra's needle upon it, as a mark of the esteem which I entertained for her, and the sense I have of her attentions. She insisted upon taking it down herself. I cannot, added he, conceive how the Admiral can think of attempting to excuse a man so unlike himself, and whose conduct I know he cannot approve of in his heart. Napoleon then said that he had asked Colonel Fagan several questions about the military penal code. Of this subject, added he, I am a master, and I framed many of the laws myself. I am a doctor of laws, and while the code Napoleon was forming, I had repeated disputations and discussions with the compilers of it, who were astonished at the knowledge which I possessed on the subject. I also originated many of the best of the laws. 20th, an order received by Captain Poppleton from Sir Hudson Lowe to reply by signal yes or no whether Lady Malcolm, Major Voice, and Captain Jones had been in with General Bonaparte at the same time with Admiral. Learned that the governor appeared to be very uneasy that some observations made by Napoleon on Lord Bathurst's speech should have been repeated by a captain in the Navy at Solomon's shop, which circumstance had been reported to him by Sir Thomas Reed immediately after it occurred. An official report again made to His Excellency by the orderly officer of the quality of the bread supplied to Longman, which is so bad that for a considerable time Napoleon had been obliged to make use of biscuit. 24th, Napoleon's cheeks swelled and inflamed, chiefly caused by a carious tooth. Some uneasiness manifested at Plantation House at the declaration made by 2 captains in the Navy of their intentions towards Sir Thomas Reed, whom they accuse of some practices of espionage towards them, which had not been warranted either by their situation or conduct. 27th, Lord Amherst arrived. 28th, Lord Amherst and suite, accompanied by the governor, paid a visit to Count and Countess Bertrand. Napoleon observed that the civilities of the governor were those of a jailer. When he came to Bertrand's with the ambassador, said he merely introduced him as Lord Amherst, and then, without sitting down or conversing for a moment, like a gentleman, turned about and took his leave, like a jailer or a turnkey who points out his prisoners to visitors and turns the key and leaves them together. Having come up with Lord Amherst, he ought to have remained for a quarter of an hour and then left them. July 3rd, Admiral Plampin, who arrived 2 or 3 days ago in the Conqueror, came to Longwood with Captain Davy, his flag captain, and his secretary, Mr. Elliot. They were introduced to Napoleon by Sir Pulteney Malcolm. Saw Napoleon afterwards, who remarked the singular difference of appearance between Sir Pulteney Malcolm and his successor. Few men said he has so prepossessing an exterior and manner as Malcolm, but the other reminds me of one of those drunken little Dutch shippers that I have seen in Holland, sitting at a table with a pipe in his mouth, and cheese and a bottle of Geneva before him. On my return from town, dined with the Emperor tete-a-tete in his writing room. He was in very good humor, spoke about Sir Pulteney and Lady Malcolm, asked if I had seen the new admiral, made some remarks on the late attacks made on the validity of his title to the crown. By the doctrines put forth by your government writers, said he, upon the subject of legitimacy, every throne in Europe would be shaken from its foundation. If I was not a legitimate sovereign, William III was a usurper of the throne of England, as he was brought in chiefly by the aid of foreign bayonets. George I was placed on the throne by a faction composed of a few nobles. I was called to that of France by the votes of nearly 4 million of Frenchmen. In fact, the calling of me a usurper is an absurdity which your ministers will in the end be obliged to abandon. If my title to the crown of France is not legitimate, what is that of George III? Dinner was served on a little round table. The emperor sat on the sofa and I on a chair opposite. I was very hungry and did great justice to what was presented to me. Napoleon said that he should like to see me drunk and ordered Marchand to bring a bottle of champagne, of which he took one glass himself and made me finish the rest, calling out in English several times, "Doctor, drink, drink!"